Do want to take you out to some breaking news that we are following. The latest developments here out of the Middle East as the sister of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh has apparently been killed in an Israeli military strike. This happening over in Gaza. Israeli media reporting the information via Palestinian sources. Now, at this point, few details have been made available, but you can see this post coming in from the official page for the Israel War Room. We do know that back in April, 3 of the leader's sons were killed in an Israeli airstrike on Gaza as well. A lot of different developments to touch on this morning, so I do want to bring in a guest, Professor Simon Mabon, the chair in international relations at Lancaster University. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Of course. Well, first off, I do want to talk about that situation right there, as a lot of the information is really coming in here. Does it change anything as far as whether or not Hamas does have to retaliate immediately when you do have the sibling of a Hamas leader killed in an airstrike?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because while the Hamas leadership may want to retaliate and maybe seem that they think they have to retaliate because of the position that they're in. It's sort of a leader's family, so there's the expectation, perhaps. The capacity for that is another question in light of everything that's gone on since sort of October 7 and the devastation that we've seen in Gaza. But unfortunately, what I think is happening is we're just seeing more and more deaths playing out in this devastating conflict that began with the harrowing murder of all those Israelis back on October 7.
All right, I do want to talk a little bit more about the situation in the north right now, because we're seeing that escalating situation with the attacks by Hezbollah on Israel specifically. We know that they are intensifying. Does it appear that the U.S. and other allies would back and help Israel if a war is declared there against Hezbollah?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in the sense that if we focus purely on Gaza, you'd start to see these serious frictions starting to emerge between the White House and between Mr. Netanyahu in Israel. But on Lebanon and on Hezbollah in particular, there seems to be more of a united front. We know that officials from the White House have gone to Lebanon and have sought to get a message to Hezbollah and to other key stakeholders in Lebanon to say that, look, the US will stand behind Israel if it goes to the point where it escalates to a conflict. And we know that US officials have said the same thing to Israeli officials, their Israeli counterparts, when they went to the White House a few days ago. So it seems that there is a pretty strong position that the White House is taking on this. And it's not all that surprising. Hezbollah is not a popular organization in the West. It is prescribed as a terrorist organization by a large number of people. And so I think it's pretty clear that there is a unified front here in support of Israel. And yet there is a big question mark over the role of Iran in all of this, which adds a further geopolitical complication to the dynamics at play.
And we've seen constant attacks by Hezbollah over on northern Israel since the day after the October 7th attack there by Hamas. So my question for you, how would a full-scale war actually differ from what we're already seeing in that region?
Well, we've been seeing these types of skirmishes ever since Hezbollah emerged in the early 1980s. We've been seeing these types of cross-border tit-for-tat skirmishes over this 42-year period. But what we've seen since October 7 is a bit of an escalation. It's not quite reached the high-level intensity of a conflict, but if we want to see what that might look like, we go to 2006 and the summer war that saw Hezbollah against the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, that was a devastating conflict that saw over 1,000 Lebanese killed, close to 200 Israelis killed, and the destruction of large parts of Beirut, particularly Dahia, the suburbs. And that came, of course, at a huge reconstruction cost for the Lebanese state. In addition, of course, there were over 1 million people displaced from their homes in Lebanon and approximately 300,000 to 500,000 Israelis displaced from their homes. So it was a pretty serious conflict that had long-lasting reverberations. But now there's the question, again, of Iran and Iran's involvement in any future escalation.
We know that whistleblowers over the past several days have come forward and said that Hezbollah is actually storing weapons inside the airport in Beirut, which would be a huge situation. So what do you make of those claims overall?
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange one. I'm not a baggage handler at an airport, I should add, before I give this answer. But my assumption is that baggage handlers are not typically allowed to open boxes or crates, regardless of what they may suspect to be inside it. So there's been quite a strong rebuttal to this story that was initially published in the Telegraph over the weekend by Lebanese officials who have condemned the story, have framed it as a form of psyops, have framed it as part of a bigger warmongering operation, by whom I'm not entirely sure, but that was the narrative. So I'm a little bit skeptical in the sense that we don't know who has the ability to open these boxes. Certainly not the baggage handler whistleblowers that we're suspecting. They're also saying that high-level Hezbollah officials have been seen in and around the airport. Again, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. But apparently the Lebanese government has set in place a series of tours for senior diplomats from the EU and from other states around the Rafik Hariri airport to show them that this is not happening. But I mean, the argument is that Iran is shipping weapons through Rafik Hariri airport to Hezbollah. But that's just the narrative, and it's difficult to ascertain the truth of it.
And I know here in America, if you are a baggage handler, you're probably not allowed to open those boxes either, I would imagine. So I would imagine most places do have that same rule overall. Now, my question is, because these rumors, these claims are starting to circulate, would Israel actually attack Beirut's airport? That is a large airport that is used by so many people.
Yeah, it is a large airport. There's an estimated 8 million people using it each year. We're getting into prime tourist season, although it's getting hotter and hotter in Beirut. So I'm not sure how many people would want to be going there right now. But would Israel attack? Well, if they believed that this intelligence was correct and they had the evidence and the intelligence to back it up, then we know there is a precedent for that. We know Israel has done this in the past. So in light of the situation that it is in right now, in light of the growing sense of insecurity in Israel, the growing tensions with Hezbollah, the growing number of rockets and missiles launched by Hezbollah, I think that if they felt they had the intelligence and that the intelligence was correct, then yes, I think they would attack. And we've seen them do that in the past.
Speaking overall here, if a war is declared by Israel against Hezbollah or Hezbollah against Israel, whatever happens there, what is likely to happen to Lebanon as a whole, as a location there?
Lebanon is in an incredibly difficult position right now. It's been hit really, really hard socially and economically by a whole series of events dating back from before the pandemic. And I'll give you an example here, that the value of the Lebanese lira, which is the currency, is now 10% what it was 5 years ago. And so with that in mind, you've seen a huge level of capital flight. You've seen a huge level of mass migration out of Lebanon. 80% of the country is living under the poverty line. An estimated 36% of those are living under the extreme poverty line, which means essentially they are living on under $2.15 a day. There's around 1 million Syrian refugees displaced during the conflict in neighboring Syria. And so the reason for saying this is that there's a lot of people there who are living in extremely vulnerable conditions. There is limited access to electricity. There is limited access to water, limited access to healthcare. And in the south, where there have been these tit-for-tat exchanges, the very ways of life that people have relied on for decades have been destroyed because of the impact of the munitions and the arms that have been used on the soil. So we're seeing a growing number of people migrating from rural parts of the country to Beirut, to the bigger cities. So all of this means there's going to be a real sense of instability, a real precarious landscape in a state that has already been beset by sectarian religious differences that fought a devastating bloody civil war in the 70s and 80s. And so a conflict would have a devastating repercussion for the people in Lebanon.
And my last question for you, going back to the situation in Gaza, if a ceasefire hostage release deal is basically agreed upon by Israel and Hamas, they come together and say, this is what we're going to do, a ceasefire happens, does that impact the Hezbollah attacks on Israel? Do they suddenly stop? Is that over?
It's a tricky one because whilst there is certainly a connection between October 7 and what we're seeing now, Hezbollah's essence, its raison d'etre, has been standing in opposition to Israel. It frames itself as part of this quote-unquote resistance bloc, and it uses its position against Israel to cultivate support amongst people in Lebanon and across the wider Middle East. So if there is this off-ramp in Gaza, if there is a de-escalation or a ceasefire, that would go some way into taking a de-escalatory step in Lebanon. But there are also other possible reverberations in the sense that any de-escalation would allow Benjamin Netanyahu to repurpose troops to the north, which could potentially then increase tensions with Hezbollah. But also, the de-escalation, a ceasefire, would not transform Hezbollah's essence. It would not change how the group sees itself and how it positions itself against Israel. So there's a whole host of complex factors that have come together here. And that's why it's such a precarious and such a devastating situation right now.
All right. Professor Simon Mabon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and break down some of the latest developments that are happening. So many of them going on in the Middle East, pretty much on an hourly basis. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
I think the most important thing is just to remember that there are lives of people who are living in awful conditions and living in fear. And that while we talk about politics, we talk about war between states, between the Hamas and Israel, or between Hezbollah and Israel, there are people, civilians, people who are trying to live their lives, feed their children, get their children to school, to live their daily lives. And just because someone is living in Gaza, it doesn't mean they necessarily support Hamas. Similarly, if they're living in South Lebanon, it doesn't mean they necessarily support Hezbollah. So I would urge people just to remember that politics is fundamentally about people, and that there are a whole host of people in Israel who are fearing for their lives, who are living in fear, who are worried about their families. Similarly, in Gaza and in Lebanon. So I would just urge people to remember this is about people, not just about the grand machinations of geopolitics.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.